This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. This week, we're actually talking about Pioneer Masters. This will probably be the only time I talk about this set on the channel. You know, I ran a poll seeing how interested people were in this limited format. The number was not especially high, and that's usually how it goes. You know, the one time I did do like a full set review and all the usual videos for an arena-only set, like the Alchemy Horizons Baldur's Gate set, it did horribly because there's just a lot fewer people who want to play sets that are only on arena. And running that poll sort of solidified the fact that I probably shouldn't dedicate a ton of my time to a format that, you know, most people aren't going to play. But I did think doing one video where I do sort of a format overview. The biggest thing I'm going to do in this video is look at the various archetypes. But I want to start by talking about, you know, what exactly Pioneer Masters is. And it's a set that has the main goal of just getting cards from Pioneer on Arena, the Pioneer format, which goes back to cards all the way to 2013. And of course, Arena wasn't around for those first several years of cards that are legal for Pioneer. And they need to make more of them be on Arena so people can play Pioneer on Arena, more or less. So that's like the main goal of the set. They did also make it draftable, which is of course nice for people who like limited, especially, you know, if you want to try something different than what the mainstream limited format is right now of Foundations. But I am kind of skeptical of how good a limited format it's going to be because, you know, they were pigeonholed into having to include a ton of cards that are there for Pioneer. It makes it a lot harder to design when you're having to print a certain subset of cards. One cool thing that they're doing, and they did it with the Shadows over Innistrad remastered set too, is that there is a bonus sheet in these packs. And it depends on when you play the format. Like the first bonus sheet is Planeswalkers, which will be around from December 10th to 24th. That's a bonus sheet that has a bunch of Planeswalkers. Also, they made sure to put a bunch of cards in that can destroy Planeswalkers at the same time, so that's good. There's also spells from December 24th to January 7th. You know, that will have a lot of big splashy spells. Split cards and things like that are going to be part of that format. And then there's Devotion, which will be around from January 7th to 21st. That should keep the format a little more fresh, and it also gives them a way to print certain cards that doesn't like affect the format the entire time, which, you know, that's probably one of the big reasons they're doing it. So there are 10 2-color archetypes, and there's also one sort of 5-color archetype, and what I want to do is look at sort of the signpost cards for each of these archetypes and talk about how I think they'll perform. I'm not talking about the bonus sheets at all, like the cards that are only in bonus sheets here, mostly because, you know, those aren't going to be around for the whole format. And I think the core of the format being built around these color pairs is more or less going to stay the same. All right, so let's take a look first at Red-White, which is this time around a heroic deck. Heroic is a mechanic that pays you off for casting a spell that targets your creatures. It's similar to Valiant, which we saw in Bloomburrow, which that was the red-white archetype there, except Valiant can only trigger once, and Valiant also triggered off of any kind of targeting you do, including from activated abilities. So make sure you know the difference. It does come up. There's some upside that Heroic has that Valiant doesn't, but there's also some downside that Heroic has that Valiant doesn't. Most colors have 2 uncommons and 1 common in this sort of signpost slot. You know, when I say signpost card, I mean it's a card that is both colors of a particular color pair, and it really tells you what you should be doing in that color pair. And so I think probably the most exciting of these signposts is Annex and Cymede. This was originally a rare back in Theros, so, you know, downshifting it to uncommon is kind of amazing. I mean, a 3-mana 3/2 with First Strike and Vigilance is a card you would play 100% of the time, more or less. And then it has Heroic, and it's a pretty legit Heroic trigger since it gives everything +1/+1 and Trample. The other uncommon for Red-White is 10th District Legionnaire. It doesn't say Heroic on it because it was originally printed in a set that didn't have Heroic, But it basically has heroic. It's actually kind of weird they didn't just throw the keyword onto this card. I mean, I get that it wasn't on it originally, but heroic is a pretty big theme in this set in general, and not even just in red-white. Like, there's a bunch of heroic cards. But anyway, it also has a nice heroic trigger and a nice baseline as a 2-mana 2/2 haste, and it gets a +1/+1 counter in Scry 1 whenever you cast a spell that targets it. So generally, like, the thing you want to be doing in a heroic deck is obviously targeting your stuff, generally with combat tricks, and you can get a lot of value out of doing it. It can be a little bit awkward, especially in limited, like, there aren't that many cards you use to target your own creature in a typical limited game, and you can only run so many combat tricks, so there's a bit of tension there where, you know, maybe red-white ends up having more of a heroic sub-theme than being all about heroic because, you know, even with a bunch of heroic, you can't run like 7 combat tricks. However, while the first 2 signpost cards, those 2 uncommons we just looked at, have heroic, the signpost common is a heroic enabler. It's Martial Glory, which for a red and a white gives target creature +3/+0 until end of turn, and target creature +0/+3 until end of turn. You can target the same creature, so for 2 mana you get +3/+3, which is an okay stats boost, but especially in a heroic deck. But what can get really silly is if you have multiple heroic cards, Martial Glory can trigger 2 of them, because you can target 2 different creatures. So, you know, pretty obvious what red-white's about. I'm a little skeptical of really pulling it off in limited, but you do have 2 really good payoffs for doing it. It's just that, you know, you'll probably only have 5 or 6 cards that trigger it in your whole deck, so it's not like every turn you'll be triggering heroic, which is kind of what you could do in Bloomburrow, because it counted any kind of targeting, unlike these. So that's red-white. It is a heroic deck. All right, so next let's look at blue-red. It's, you know, sort of the classic archetype for blue-red. A lot of these are kind of classic archetypes, which, given that we just played Foundations, which had a bunch of classic archetypes, I don't know if I love that, but hey, you know, that is what they're doing here. And yeah, so blue-red is a spell deck, as it often is, and Storm Chaser Mage is one of the signpost uncommons. It's a 2-mana 1/3 with Flying, Haste, and Prowess. You know, that's pretty good. It can get it in the air really easily. Your opponent always has to respect Prowess. You know, it's just a strong mechanic in general because you can, you know, buff your creature at least once most of the time, and your opponent has to be worried about it. The other uncommon is Steam Augury. Now, it's not a spell payoff, but it's a nice spell. And as you reveal the top 5 cards of your library and separate them into 2 piles, an opponent chooses one, and you put that pile into your hand and the other into the graveyard. So it both puts a bunch of cards in your graveyard and draws you at least 2 cards, generally speaking. I am a little skeptical of a card like this in limited. You know, this probably isn't your typical limited format, and, you know, neither was Foundations to some extent. But for most limited formats lately, spending this much mana and not adding to the board is kind of dangerous. You know, there are a bunch of spell payoffs in the set. You know, the 4-mana 1/5 that makes a 1/1 flyer when you cast an instant or sorcery, for example. And if you can add those sorts of triggers to the mix, that makes Steam Augury a lot better. And you're going to have them in blue-red. And then the common here is Nivix Cyclops, which is 1 generic, a blue and a red for a 1/4 with Defender. And whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, it gets +3/+0 until end of turn and can attack this turn as though it didn't have Defender. This is not a card I'd love all that much either, mostly because, you know, what makes spell payoff creatures really good a lot of the time is the threat of activation, right? Like, you can attack with your 1/3 into your opponent's 2/2 flyer, you know, the 1/3 prowess we saw, and your opponent kind of has to take the hit because there's a very real chance that you can buff your creature. Well, with Nivix Cyclops, even for it to attack, it has to lose its defender, right? So that means it's already a 3/4. Sure, you might be able to make it even bigger, but it's less likely. Your opponent knows exactly what they're dealing with to some extent when you're the one who's trying to attack. If you're blocking, it can work a little bit differently, but it's not a common that I love. I do think this archetype, though, and all of these really, have a bunch of support outside of just the signposts. Also, this one might get a bump during the period where there's a spell bonus sheet, as, you know, there'll be more spells around. Let's look at blue-white now, which is a Tempo Skies deck, of course, as it often is. You have Thunderclap Wyvern is one of the uncommons. This is a flying lord, one that also has flash, so that's can sort of play into the tempo thing. You can leave your mana up for instants and stuff, or flash this in and ambush block something, flash it in and buff the rest of your board if you have other flyers and you're in blue-white, so you probably do. So it looks like a pretty good signpost uncommon to me. It does have kind of low toughness, but flash I think really helps make up for that. There's also Azorius Charm is the other uncommon. This is a really good charm. I mean, most of them are unlimited, but this one has, the mode you're going to like the most frequently is probably put target attacking or blocking creature on top of its owner's library. Paying 2 mana for that effect is pretty good. Probably would be a playable card if it ended there, but then you have these other modes, getting lifelink can sometimes swing a race in your favor, or you can draw a card with it. So it's just a really good card with some tempo stuff going on thanks to the attacking or blocking creature going to its owner's library. And then the common is Liev Sky Knight, which is a 3-mana 3/1 with flying, so gets buffed by your Wyvern. And when it enters, it detains target non-land permanent opponent controls. Detaining means that until your next turn, the permanent can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. It's sort of like stunning a creature, and it's sort of like phasing, but it's not exactly either of them. Stunning a creature doesn't necessarily turn off activated abilities, and phasing, makes it so the card doesn't exist even more, because if it has static abilities or whatever, they aren't counted either. Either way, it's a pretty good card. I mean, if you go 1-drop, 2-drop, Liev Sky Knight, detain their only creature, attack, you're in a pretty great position, especially if your other creatures have flying, then you play that Wyvern on 4. So, these signposts all look pretty good to me. You do have one that's sort of less focused on the archetype because it doesn't have to do with flying like Thunderclap Wyvern and Liev Sky Knight do, but it's just a great card, Azorius Charm is. So blue-white looks like it has a good foundation to me. Let's look at black-green now, which is, of course, a graveyard deck. One of your signpost uncommons here is Nyx Weaver. It is a 3-mana 2/3 enchantment creature spider with reach, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you mill 2 cards. So it really helps set up the graveyard for you for all kinds of shenanigans. And you can even get rid of the Weaver to return a card from your graveyard to your hand. Sometimes when you draw it late, you'll just do that right away. It can do it at instant speed, so it also can chump block, and then you sack it to get a card back from your graveyard. It's just a nice enabler that also is it's less good as a payoff. It's better as an enabler, but it can do both. It's the kind of signpost that will set up graveyard decks really well. The other uncommon is kind of interesting for black-green. It's one of these where clearly they wanted to get this card on Arena because it's being played to some degree in Pioneer, and that is Catacomb Sifter. It does not do something with the graveyard, really, at all. It's just a 3-mana 2/3 that makes a 1/1 token that can be sacked for colorless mana. And when a creature you control dies, you scry 1. I guess that's the closest it gets to doing graveyard stuff, because if you're losing creatures and they're ending up in your graveyard, you get to scry. But the Sifter is a really good card. It was amazing in Battle for Zendikar Limited. It's seen play in 60-card formats too. Even if that token couldn't be sacked for value, and even without scry, 3-mana 2/3 make a 1/1 is a really good card. So even if it's not exactly a synergy piece for the graveyard stuff, it's just a good card that you're going to be pretty happy to play. And the common for black-green is Dreg Mangler. So this one, we do get back to the graveyard here. It comes with Scavenge in addition to being a 3-mana 3/3 with haste. And Scavenge is a mechanic where you exile the card from your graveyard and pay that cost, and you put a number of +1/+1 counters equal to this card's power on target creature. So the Mangler is pretty nice. 3-mana 3/3 haste is a solid little card, even when it's kind of hard to cast. And then, like in the late game, when you're flooding out, you can just scavenge and make one of your creatures into a much bigger threat. I mean, obviously, paying 5 for 3 counters isn't what you want to be doing like as a baseline, but it's a very nice way to get additional value out of the Mangler. It kind of feels like a 2-for-1. It's probably not quite worth 2 cards between the body and the scavenge, but it's not crazy far off either. So, looks like a pretty good common. All right, next let's look at black-white, which is a sacrifice deck this time around. One of your signpost uncommons is Cartel Aristocrat, a 2-mana 2/2 that lets you sack a creature for free, and the Aristocrat gains protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. So free sacrifice outlets always enable like combos and stuff like that can kind of go crazy, even in limited. If you have an effect that drains your opponent's life every time a creature dies, this kind of card can easily find lethal for you. On top of the fact that just being an incredibly difficult to kill or block 2-mana 2/2. So, it's a really nice signpost uncommon. It's going to be one of the best sacrifice outlets for this particular deck. There's also Sin Collector. This is another one that's mostly here so that they could put it in Pioneer, as it's a card that, has been played in Pioneer. Problem is, in Limited, it's not that great. It only goes after instants and sorceries. It's 3-mana 2/1. When it enters, you look at your opponent's hand and make them discard an instant or sorcery, and actually they exile it. You're just not going to have a target often enough in Limited. Like, if you did, this would be kind of a nice sacrifice outlet because it takes a card away when it enters, then you can sack it for value, right? But the Collector is just going to whiff a huge chunk of the time in Limited. And, this one's probably kind of unplayable. It's kind of, the Catacomb Sifter is like, it doesn't really do the synergy stuff this color pair wants to do, but at least it's a really good card. Sin Collector, not so much, unfortunately. And, not having a full complement of good signpost cards is maybe a problem. You do have a good signpost common here, though, because you've got Imperial Oligarch, 2-mana 2/1 with Vigilance and Afterlife 1. Afterlife 1 means when it dies, you get a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token with flying. So, you play this on 2, rumble with it a few times, maybe you trade with it and get a 1/1 flyer. It also gives you 2 bodies to sacrifice for value, so it slots in really nicely. Blue-black is a control deck, as it often is. It's got some graveyard stuff going on too, as it often does. It's sort of a combination, a control deck that wants to grind out value from the graveyard. One of the signposts here is Possessed Scab, a 5-mana 3/2. And when it enters, you can return an instant, sorcery, or creature from your graveyard to your hand. If it dies, it gets exiled. That's too bad, because you could loop them, but they don't want you to be able to do it. But that's a good card. I mean, the stat line's pretty bad, but it comes down, gets you a very real card back from your library, your graveyard, like a creature or a removal spell. That's going to feel pretty great. So it's one of these cards that really grinds out a 2-for-1 for you. You do have to reach that stage of the game, though. The other signpost uncommon is Tomebound Lich. This is one of those cards that can help you get to the later stage of the game. Also helps you load your graveyard because it's a 3-mana 1/3 with Death Touch and Lifelink. And when it enters or deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card and then discard a card. So helps put stuff in the graveyard, helps improve the cards in your hand, can trade for anything and gain you life while it does it. It's just a perfect card for what this color pair wants to do. And then your other signpost uncommon is Dinrova Horror. This is a really nice top curve to have. Like, a lot of blue-black decks, if they have like 2 of these at the top of their curve, it's going to be hard for them to lose. This is because it's a 6-mana 4/4, it comes into play, bounces a permanent, and makes them discard a card. You get a 2-for-1, in other words. And unlike most discard effects where you're like, this is kind of irrelevant in the late game, well, if it's the late game and your opponent's in top deck mode, this just turns into 6-mana 4/4, destroy target creature, which itself is also really good. Obviously, it gets more interesting if you can rebuy the enters trigger and everything, but it's just a really good card in general. Adding to the board, subtracting from your opponent's board with 6 mana is exactly what you want to be doing in a deck like this. If it isn't, it's probably not going to be like your finisher necessarily, but it'll buy you the time to find it, or if you've already got stuff in play to finish your opponent, help you do it that way. All right, let's move to green-white now. This looks to be a fairly straightforward aggro deck, but with an enchantment, especially aura sub-theme. But a lot of what it has to offer is just super efficient creatures. For example, one of the signpost uncommons is Loxodon Smiter, which is just a 3-mana 4/4. Also can't be countered. And on the off chance your opponent makes you discard it, like with Dinrova Horror, which would be kind of funny, it just comes into play. There are discard effects in the format. It doesn't make that big of a difference on this card, but it does make a difference. Like, occasionally it will be put into play for free. Mostly, though, you're pretty thrilled about just slamming this on turn 3 and having a 4/4, which is really hard for other limited cards to keep up with. The other signpost uncommon is Unflinching Courage. So this is one of those cards, one of those auras that really, you want to be playing some of in this deck because you've got payoffs for it and you've got great targets for it. This one gives +2/+2, trample, and lifelink. One very notable thing is that there is hexproof in this format at lower rarities and on cheap cards. And so, slamming Unflinching Courage onto something that has hexproof is pretty gross. Namely, those cards are Glade Cover Scout and Basara Tower Archer, 2 green cards that are great places to put auras. including this one. And then your common here is Selesnya Charm, which for a green and a white is an instant. It can be a decent combat trick, gives +2/+2 and trample. That's something aggro decks like. Can also make a 2/2 White Knight creature token with vigilance, and you can do it at instant speed, so you can ambush block their 1/2 or whatever. And it can also act as a removal spell, although a narrow one. It can kill a lot of the big bombs. So yeah, I mean, green-white is an aggro deck. It's definitely interested in auras. But I think first and foremost, it's just a deck where you want to curve out, use combat tricks to break through and do lethal. Next, let's look at black-red. This one is kind of all over the place. I mean, not in a huge way, I guess, but it kind of looks like a black-red good stuff deck, which just isn't what you see usually. Basically, it's like a deck with really good removal and really good recursion on top of that. So maybe black-red is more of a control deck this time around than we're used to seeing. So you've got 2 signpost uncommons, of course. One of them is Blood Tithe Harvester, which was an insanely good signpost uncommon when we saw it in Crimson Vow. It's still going to be good here because it's a 2-mana 3/2 that makes a blood token. Like, you'd always play that, and you can sack it to kill something. Bad news is there isn't a single other card in this format that makes blood. In Crimson Vow, that wasn't true. This could take down all kinds of things. Most you're going to get here is -2/-2. I guess if you have multiple harvesters, maybe you get there, but black-red is not a blood deck, despite what this card was telling us last time it was a signpost uncommon. Mostly this is just a card that gives you some nice value because the blood token's pretty good and it can kill stuff occasionally. The other signpost uncommon is Swift Warkite. This one is interesting. It wasn't that good in Dragons of Tarkir Limited, and it worries me a little here. It's a 6-mana 4/4 flyer, which isn't great. It does have a nice enter trigger. You can reanimate a mana value 3 or less card, and it gains haste, and then you return that card to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. So, getting black a Blood Tithe Harvester would feel pretty good, for example, because you get some value out of it, and you could use the ability right away. But yeah, overall, this doesn't look great to me, the Warkite. It's just too expensive for what it is, and there are plenty of mana value 3 or less creatures that aren't that great to bring back too. Like, there are lots of boards where the best 3-drop in your graveyard just can't attack. You do get the card back, ultimately, but it's still not something I love. But the signpost common is something I love. It's Dreadbore, which for a black and a red, destroys a creature or planeswalker. It's a sorcery, sure, but like, you pay 2, it kills anything. Will probably be even better once they have the planeswalker sheet available, because blowing up planeswalkers is going to be pretty important. But yeah, it's just a great removal spell, and that's why I say, like, these 3 cards don't really have like a through line that connects them all, other than that they are black-red. To some extent, I guess you could say, like, playing removal and grinding out value is what you want to do, but overall black-red looks a little bit unfocused. But a card like Dreadbore is likely to make a deck like that a pretty good control deck, especially at common. Red-green also looks like an aggro deck. I mean, a little less aggressive. Red-green usually has less good, like, 1 and 2 drops, but, you end up with pretty good 3, 4, 5, and that's usually where you kind of end up pulling ahead. And red-green has, of course, the 2 signpost uncommons. One of them is Gore Clan Rampager. It's a 4-mana 4/4 with trample, which is a nice little 4-drop, but it's also got Blood Rush, which basically turns it into a really good combat trick. Paying a red and a green and discarding it gives +4/+4 and trample to an attacking creature. It does only buff an attacking creature, so it's an inherently aggressive combat trick, but, combat tricks are at their best when you're attacking anyway. It is a little bit of a bummer you can't use it to save a creature from damage removal or something too, but, it's also a 4-mana 4/4 trampler, and the combat trick side of things will make almost any creature win almost any combat and get in for more damage, and only for 2 mana, which is pretty serious. The other signpost uncommon is yet another one of these cards that's here more for the Pioneer players. It is Destructive Revelry, which is one of the best naturalized-like effects we've ever seen. But there aren't so many enchantments and artifacts in this set that you'll be mainboarding this most of the time. There are some, but yeah, I mean, it's mostly a useless card in Limited. I kind of wish they had printed extra signposts and stuff for these instances where one of them just isn't a relevant card. It does worry me that certain color pairs will be more unbalanced. The ones that have, like, access to 3 real signpost cards that are all good are just probably on average going to be better than the ones that have like random card printed for 60 card Pioneer. And your common here is Zendikar Incarnate, a 4 mana star 4 with power equal to the number of lands you control. This also not that exciting, unfortunately for green. I think the Blood Rush Rampager is really good. The other two, not so much. I mean, you know, this does grow. It'll be a 4 mana 4/4 when you play it on curve. And it can grow throughout the game, but not doing anything other than being a big vanilla creature is not that exciting. You know, you'll play it, I'm sure, but it's like a C minus level card, so not something you're excited about playing in your red-green deck. So yeah, overall red-green worries me probably the most based on the quality of its signpost uncommons. And then the last 2-color deck, I say that because there's one additional deck in the format I want to talk about before we finish here. But the last 2-color combination is blue-green ramp. And this one is pretty obvious. All 3 cards are really telling you what you need to be doing in blue-green. For example, one of your signpost uncommons is Kiora's Follower, which for a green and a blue is a 2/2, and you can tap it to untap other permanents. Blue-green is a ramp deck, and this lets you ramp your mana. It has other utility too. Sometimes you can use an activated ability that involves a tap twice. You can also do it at instant speed, of course, so there's a lot of utility on the Follower, but blue-green really wants to be a ramp deck, and that's the main thing you're going to be doing with that untap effect. You've also got Urban Evolution, a 5 mana draw 3 that also lets you play an additional land. You know, as you probably know, I'm going to say this card worries me a little bit because it doesn't really add to the board. I mean, 5 mana draw 3 sorcery speed is a little bit dangerous, but it does ramp your mana, helps you find your things to ramp into as well. So, you know, it might work well in this deck. Not as well as the Follower, who's like, you know, a card apart from having the, you know, this kind of effect that doesn't add to the board. And then there's Skyrider Elf as the signpost common, and this shows you a certain additional angle for blue-green, so it's about ramping, but Skyrider Elf has Converge, which means it gets better the more colors of mana you spend on it. So you can pay a green and a blue for this and play it as a 2/2 flyer, but if you have other colors of mana around, you know, let's say you have 5, it's a 5 mana 5/5 flyer. So yeah, I mean, that is a doable thing in blue-green ramp. You know, the cards we looked at don't let you search up a basic land of any type or whatever and put them into play. But they do exist, especially in green. So setting that up is going to be pretty doable. But this also serves as a pretty good segue into the last deck I want to talk about, because green-blue is probably going to be the best base for that style of deck. And that deck is 5-color Gates. If you played during Ravnica Allegiance, you know that this was a very legit deck in that format. So the common dual lands in this format are all Gates. This means they produce 2 colors of mana, they have the Gate subtype, and then the format is loaded up with lots and lots of ways to get value out of Gates across every color. Some of the notable ones are Archway Angel. This was one that could stabilize you in a big way back in Ravnica Allegiance. Usually you were paying 6 and playing this and gaining like 10 life, which is pretty hard to overcome for most opponents. You also had more aggressive cards like Gatebreaker Ram, which gets bigger the more gates you have. You have a board sweeper in the form of Gates Ablaze. You've also got Opal Lake Gatekeepers and Ubal Sar Gatekeepers, which give you value if you control 2 or more gates. The Opal Lake one draws you a card, and the Ubal Sar one kills an opposing creature, well, as long as it's a 2/2 or X2 or smaller. You've also got Gate Colossus, which is huge. And it might sound like, well, how am I going to get all these gates? How is this going to work out that way? And it's true. You do need to spend your picks on lots of gates to make these decks work. But if it's anything like last time, cards like Archway Angel and Gatebreaker Ram and the Colossus especially are well worth going that route. They're just such powerful payoffs that your opponent has to contend with. And the gates are at common. There's also Gateway Plaza, which can give you mana of any color. So, you know, if you've played, like, for example, if you played recently, the most recent set where this was sort of a thing was Thunder Junction, where picking up deserts ahead of, like, A lot of cards was kind of a good idea because the desert payoffs were so good. That's kind of what this is like if you haven't played with gates before. So, I mean, I think this will be a legit deck. It was one of the most powerful things you could possibly do in Ravnica Allegiance, and they gave us a bunch of the same cards, and really they gave us the best ones, while also adding those gatekeepers to the mix, which weren't in Ravnica Allegiance. So overall, this is probably the deck I'm most excited to play. I really loved it in Ravnica Allegiance, and, I'm probably not going to draft this format a ton, but when I do, I'm probably going to try to draft Gates because it's a really fun deck to play. So those are the 10 archetypes plus the Gates deck, which is, I think, basically a spinoff of Blue-Green most of the time. If you really want to see more Pioneer Masters content, well, like this video, post a comment. I have a feeling it's not going to do as well as a typical episode of Needs and Notes based on past experience, but I guess we'll see. If this video miraculously does really, really well, I might post some drafts and stuff too. Anyway, that does it for this video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all in the next one.